All right, hey again, Drawing One students. Today we're going to start a 2-week explanation of light and shadow, and today I'll run through some pretty basic fundamental ideas about light and shade, and then we'll follow it up next week with some slightly more complex ideas. So as I mentioned in the Zoom meeting, if you were there, today what I want you to do is to follow along with me when I get to the drawing stage of this, to just sort of copy what I'm doing, and then I'll have an assignment on your assignment page where you'll be applying the ideas that you learned today. All right, so light and shade, it's a big topic. Light's the thing that we want to, as artists, we need to have a handle on in terms of how light and shade operates, because light's the great revealer. It sort of shows us everything. It shows us outline, it shows us volume, space, tone, color when we get to painting. So we want to have some idea about the fundamentals of light and shade, how it works. So the beginning place, as you look at our model up here, so starting off with this simple shape up here, you see that it's lit, and you see that some of it's in light and some of it's in shadow. And most people start there. They start by looking at the object, which is good and normal. But what's also important to do is to identify for yourself where the light source is coming from. And that's something that sometimes people don't do, and it's really important. It's really important to take that step to identify and articulate to yourself where the light source is coming from. Because in addition to being the great revealer, light is also a unifier. It's kind of like when we talked about perspective, when we talked about your point of view, that was an idea that allowed us to treat everything that we saw, that we were drawing in our visual field in the same way. It all kind of boiled down to your eye level, your viewpoint. That was the thing that kind of unified everything. So in terms of creating a consistent point of view. So light's the same way. If you identify where the light source is coming from, then you can treat light and shade on everything in your visual field in the same way, and that's another unifying device. All right, so there are 3 variables to light direction. One is where it is relative to the object in terms of its height. It's either above or below the object, or at the same level. So in this case, the light source is above the object, obviously. And then there's a left-right component. So here, the light source is to the right. Right, so it's above, it's to the right. And then the last variable is the light source is either in front of the object or it's behind the object. So either the light source is between you and the object, or the object is between you and the light source. So in this case here, the light source, if I put it over here, relative to me, it's in front of the object. If I put it back here, then obviously the object is between me and the light source. And in talking about this light direction, we're talking about the primary light source. So there are lots of light sources in this room. There's outside light, there are my fluorescents that are on. So a lot of lights are impacting this particular object, but there's usually one primary light source that's having the biggest impact. In this case, it's this light right here. And that's the one that we want to start with, identifying where it's coming from. Okay. So after we identify where the light source is coming from, then what we want to do is we want to go back and look at the object again and try to determine what part of that object is in the light and which part is not in the path of that light, and that's shadow. Right? So there's nothing in between. There's no such thing as like a half shadow or a half light. Things are either in the light or they're in the shadow. Now you can have lighter lights and lighter shadows and darker shadows, but it's either in the light or it's out of the light. It's in shadow. Okay? So up here, when we look at this box, obviously this is in the light and this is in shadow over here. So this is in the light over here and this is in the shadow over here. All right, so this shadow is called a form shadow. It's created by the form turning away from the light source. So that's a form shadow. And then cast shadow is when this form casts its shadow onto another form, in this case the ground plane, and that's your cast shadow. Right? So form shadow, cast shadow. And right, and and then the light. All right. So the light can weaken or it can strengthen depending on how directly it faces the light. So if we look at this plane here, this plane is facing the light more directly, so it's a lighter light. This is a darker light because this plane is facing down, away from the light, whereas this one's facing up, towards the light. So towards the light, away from the light. The more towards the light a plane in light presents, the lighter it's going to be. Also, this area is lighter than, say, this area because this is closer to the light source. So light diminishes over distance in terms of its strength. So light up here, if I have a plane up here and the same plane down here, this plane down here is going to be darker. This one's going to be lighter because it's closer to the light source. So I'm sure most of this is self-evident, but it's good to, again, to just be clear and articulate that to yourself. Give me a nudge or something when we're about at 8 minutes. All right. The other thing you'll notice up here is that some lights are lighter than other lights because of the material that's made out of, and that's called local value. So we said this is in the light, even though it's a very darker light than this, simply because of the coloration of this board. So this is a white box, this is a dark gray board, so even though it's in the light, it's much darker than this light because of what's called the local value. Again, that's just the nature of the material that's made of or painted or whatever. Same thing over here. When we look at this shadow is a cast shadow, form shadow. In this case, the cast shadow is darker than the form shadow, primarily because it's sitting on a local value that's darker, right, than the box. Again, that dark gray. All right, so once we've identified what's in the light, what's in the shadow, then and the direction of the light source, then we can start drawing the object. All right, and what we're going to do today is we're going to look at those simple geometric solids that we talked about right after perspective. If you remember, we used the sphere, the cone, the cube, and the cylinder as objects to help us try to understand more complex forms. So we do the same thing with light. We look at these simple geometric solids. If we can understand how light works on those, then we'll have a better idea of how to treat light on a more complex object. All right, so we're going to run through the rectangular solid, the cylinder, the cone, and then the sphere. And we're just going to look at the simple flat light and shadow at the beginning. So when we're drawing the light and shadow on a rectangular solid, we can see pretty clearly that division line, and that's what we want to establish at the start. We want to be very clear about the division line between light and shadow, lay that out very simply, because that usually forms the large volumetric structure. Even though we're treating it flatly, that begins us on our journey of finding the volume, is laying out that big light and shadow pattern, because that shadow pattern is usually setting up along an important plane in the object. All right, so this is my form shadow. So, and the way I block in my shadows is I just want to create a very simple, even tone. So as we'll see later, this tone, in truth, is always moving from light to dark or dark to light, but we don't worry about that at the beginning. We just want to put in what we think is a good average value for that tone. And then we do the same thing with the cast shadow. So we notice with the cast shadow that the cast shadow, when a form shadow hits a ground plane, that's where the cast shadow is going to begin. So my cast shadow is starting right here where the form shadow ends, and then it's moving uphill this way, and I won't be able to get the whole thing on, but it's kind of flaring out. But the direction of it is moving uphill. So again, I want to block in just a simple, flat, even tone, and again, the shadow actually is constantly moving, but from light to dark, dark to light. But again, I don't worry about that at the beginning. I just want to put in a very, very simple tone. Now my cast shadow I'm going to put in darker because the local value, right, of the shadow is darker than the local value on the box. So I block that shadow in very simply, and the cast shadow also makes a shape that varies. It's a sort of a sharp edge here, then it gets more blurry as it goes away from the form. We don't worry about that at the beginning. It's important to just block in that shape as best we can. Make a very definite decision about the shape. Okay. The reason this whole shadow is sort of a distorted box, it's moving uphill on my page because the light's around to the front. So because the light's around to the front, that cast shadow is thrown away from me, which means uphill on my page. If I put it around back of the form, then it's going to come downhill towards me. All right, so it's very important once you've identified where that light is coming from, to make sure that your cast shadow is moving in the right direction so that it's consistent with your idea of that light direction. How are we doing on time?
It's 11 minutes.
Okay. All right, so we'll end this here. We'll pick up in the next video, and we'll go through the other 3 forms.